Sarah Martinez looked at herself in the small mirror of the staff bathroom. Her black pants were pressed, her white shirt was clean, and her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. She took a deep breath and checked her watch. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and the biggest wedding of the year would start in just 2 hours. Sarah had been working at the Grandview Country Club for 3 years. She was 24 years old and had seen many fancy weddings, but this one was different. The Pemberton Wilson wedding was going to cost more than $100,000. There would be 200 guests, all rich and important people from the city. She walked out of the bathroom and into the kitchen. The place was busy with activity. Cooks were preparing fancy food, and other waiters were getting ready. The head chef was shouting orders, and everyone was moving fast. Sarah had worked many events like this, but she still felt nervous when the guests were very wealthy. Sarah called Mr. Henderson, her supervisor. He was a tall, thin man who always wore expensive suits. He cared more about making the rich guests happy than taking care of his workers. "You're working the main dining room tonight. Make sure you smile and be polite. These people have money, and we need them to be happy." Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand." She had heard this speech many times before. Mr. Henderson always reminded the staff that the wealthy guests were the most important thing. He never seemed to care if the guests were rude to the workers. Sarah had seen him tell waiters to apologize even when the guests were wrong. Sarah went to the supply room to get her serving tray and napkins. As she walked, she thought about why she was working so hard. Every dollar she earned went into a special savings account. She had been saving money for 3 years to pay for music school. Sarah had always dreamed of studying music, but her family could not afford to send her to college. Her mother worked at a factory, and her father drove a delivery truck. They were good people who worked hard, but they did not have extra money for Sarah's education, so Sarah decided to save the money herself. She worked double shifts whenever she could. She worked on weekends and holidays. She almost never bought new clothes or went out with friends. When Sarah was a little girl, her grandmother had taught her to play the piano. Her grandmother had been a music teacher before she got married. She had an old piano in her living room, and Sarah would spend hours practicing when she visited. Her grandmother always said that Sarah had special talent. "You have music in your soul," her grandmother would say. "Don't let anyone tell you that you can't make your dreams come true." Sarah's grandmother had died 2 years ago, but Sarah still remembered her words. The old piano now sat in Sarah's small apartment. Every night after work, no matter how tired she was, Sarah would play for at least an hour. She played classical music, jazz, and popular songs. Music was the only thing that made her forget about her tired feet and rude customers. The country club where Sarah worked was very fancy. It had big rooms with crystal lights hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered with expensive paintings, and the floors were made of shiny marble. Rich people came there for parties, business meetings, and weddings. The food was expensive, and the service was supposed to be perfect. Sarah had learned to be invisible while she worked. She would bring food and drinks, clean tables, and take away dirty dishes. The wealthy guests usually did not notice her. To them, she was just part of the background, like the fancy decorations or the soft music playing overhead. But Sarah noticed everything. She watched how the rich people talked and acted. She saw how they treated each other and how they treated the workers. Some guests were kind and polite. They would say, "Please," and "Thank you," and treat the staff with respect. But others acted like the workers were not real people. They would snap their fingers to get attention, speak rudely, and never say thank you. Sarah had learned to stay calm even when guests were mean. She would smile and do her job, even when people were rude to her. She needed this job to save money for school, so she could not afford to get fired. Today's wedding was special because it was so expensive and important. Victoria Pemberton was marrying James Wilson, and both families were very wealthy. Victoria's father owned several big companies, and James's family had old money that went back many years. The guest list included mayors, judges, business owners, and other important people. Sarah had helped prepare for the wedding all week. She had polished silver, folded napkins, and arranged flowers. She had also listened to the wedding planner talk about all the special details. There would be a live piano player during dinner, special wine from France, and a cake that cost more than Sarah made in a month. As Sarah finished getting her supplies ready, she thought about her savings account. She now had almost enough money for her first year of music school. If she could keep working for 6 more months, she would have enough money to start classes next fall. The thought made her excited and nervous at the same time. She had already applied to 3 music schools. 2 had accepted her after she sent them recordings of her piano playing. The 3rd school wanted her to audition in person. Sarah had never performed for professional music teachers before, and the thought scared her, but she also felt ready. She had been practicing for years, and she knew she was good. Her grandmother had always believed in her, and Sarah was determined to make her dream come true. Sarah walked back to the main dining room to start setting up tables. The room looked beautiful. White flowers were everywhere, and candles would be lit just before the guests arrived. The tables were set with the finest dishes and silverware the country club owned. Sarah checked each table to make sure everything was perfect. She straightened forks, adjusted napkins, and made sure the water glasses were spotless. She wanted everything to be perfect, not because Mr. Henderson was watching, but because she took pride in doing good work. As she worked, Sarah hummed quietly to herself. It was a piece by Chopin that she had been practicing at home. The melody was beautiful and sad at the same time. Sarah loved how music could express feelings that words could not describe. Soon, other workers joined her in the dining room. They all worked together to make sure everything was ready. Sarah liked most of her coworkers. They were hard-working people like her, needed their jobs to support their families. The time was now 5:30. In 1 hour, the guests would start arriving for cocktails. Sarah felt ready, but she also felt a strange feeling in her stomach. She did not know why, but something told her that tonight would be different from other nights. She had no idea how different it would actually be. The guests started arriving at 6 o'clock. Sarah watched from the kitchen as expensive cars pulled up to the country club entrance. Men in dark suits and women in beautiful dresses walked through the front doors. Their jewelry sparkled under the bright lights, and their clothes looked like they cost more money than Sarah made in several months. Sarah carried a tray of champagne glasses into the cocktail area. The room was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. People were greeting each other with hugs and kisses on the cheek. Everyone seemed happy and excited about the wedding. Sarah moved quietly through the crowd, offering champagne to the guests. Most people took a glass without really looking at her. A few said, "Thank you," but most just took the champagne and continued their conversations. Sarah was used to this. She knew that she was there to serve, not to be noticed. The bride, Victoria, looked beautiful in her white dress. It was covered with tiny pearls and had a long train that followed behind her. She was talking and laughing with her friends, and she looked very happy. The groom, James, was handsome in his black suit. He kept looking at Victoria with love in his eyes. Sarah was happy to see that the bride and groom seemed truly in love. She had worked at many weddings where the couples seemed more interested in showing off their money than in celebrating their love. But Victoria and James looked at each other like they were the only people in the room. After an hour of serving cocktails, the guests moved into the main dining room. Sarah and the other waiters quickly cleared the cocktail area and got ready to serve dinner. The dining room looked even more beautiful now that the candles were lit. The soft light made everything look magical. Sarah was assigned to serve tables 5 through 8. These tables were near the back of the room, away from where the bride and groom's families were sitting. Sarah looked at the guest list to see who she would be serving. Table 6 was reserved for friends of the groom from college. As Sarah approached Table 6 with the tray of salads, she could hear the men talking loudly. They had clearly been drinking for a while, even before dinner started. Their voices were louder than the other guests, and they were laughing at jokes that seemed to be about other people at the wedding. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely as she began placing salads in front of each guest. "Here is your first course." Most of the men ignored her, continuing their conversation. But one man, who had messy brown hair and a red face from drinking, looked Up at her, his name tag said, Brad, and Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath. Well, hello there, Brad said, looking Sarah up and down in a way that made her uncomfortable. Aren't you a pretty little thing? Sarah smiled politely, but did not respond. She had learned that it was best not to encourage guests who acted this way. She continued placing salads on the table, hoping to finish quickly and move away. I'm talking to you, sweetheart, Brad said, his voice getting louder. Don't you think it's rude to ignore someone when they're being friendly? I'm sorry, sir, Sarah said quietly. I'm just trying to serve your dinner. The other men at the table were now paying attention to what was happening. Some looked embarrassed by their friend's behavior, but none of them said anything to stop him. Brad leaned back in his chair and continued staring at Sarah. You know, you're much prettier than the other waitresses here. Have you ever thought about doing something other than serving food? I bet you could make a lot more money doing other things. Sarah felt her face turn red. She knew what he was suggesting, and it made her angry. But she also knew she had to stay professional. She needed this job, and she could not afford to get in trouble with Mr. Henderson. I need to finish serving, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. She placed the last salad on the table and started to walk away, but as she turned to leave, Brad reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was strong, and it hurt. Sarah was so surprised that she almost dropped her tray. Where are you going? So fast? Brad asked, holding onto her wrist. I'm not done talking to you yet. Why don't you sit down and have a drink with us? Sarah tried to pull her arm away, but Brad held on tighter. Sir, please let go of me, she said, her voice shaking a little. I have work to do. Come on, don't be unfriendly, Brad said. We're having a good time here. You could have fun too, instead of just working all night. The other men at the table looked uncomfortable, but still none of them said anything. One man looked away, and another took a big drink from his wine glass. Sarah realized that none of them were going to help her. Please, sir, Sarah said again, trying to sound calm. I really need you to let go of my arm. But Brad just laughed. You're being way too serious. Learn to have some fun. Life's too short to work all the time. Sarah looked around the room, hoping to catch the eye of another waiter or Mr. Henderson, but everyone else was busy serving other tables. She felt scared and alone. Sir, you're hurting me, Sarah said, her voice getting stronger. Please let go of my wrist right now. Hurting you? Brad laughed louder. I'm barely touching you. You're being dramatic. But Sarah could feel that her wrist was going to have marks from his grip. She was angry now, not just scared. How dare this man think he could treat her this way? She thought about her grandmother, who had always taught her to stand up for herself. Let go of me now, Sarah said firmly, looking Brad directly in the eyes. You have no right to touch me. Brad's face changed from amused to angry. No right? Listen, sweetheart, I'm a guest at this fancy wedding, and you're just the help. I think you need to remember your place. Sarah felt something inside her snap. She had dealt with rude customers before, but no one had ever grabbed her or spoken to her this way. She thought about all the times she had smiled and stayed quiet when guests were mean to her. She thought about all the money she had saved by working extra shifts and putting up with bad treatment. My place, Sarah said, her voice getting louder. My place is not to be grabbed and talked to like I'm not a real person. Let go of my arm right now, or I will call security. The other guests at nearby tables were starting to notice the argument. Some people turned to look at what was happening. Sarah could see that other waiters were watching too, but they seemed afraid to get involved. Brad's face was now very red, and his eyes looked mean. You little brat, he said. Do you know who I am? Do you know how much money I make? You should be grateful that someone like me is even talking to someone like you. Sarah tried one more time to pull her arm away, but Brad held on even tighter. She could feel tears starting to form in her eyes, but she was determined not to cry in front of this horrible man. I don't care how much money you make, Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. Money doesn't give you the right to treat people badly. That was when Brad did something that shocked everyone at the table. He picked up his glass of red wine and threw it at Sarah. The cold wine hit her white shirt and splashed across her black pants. The red liquid stained her uniform completely. "There," Brad said with a mean smile. "Now, you look like the mess you are. Maybe next time you'll learn to be more respectful to your betters." Sarah stood there, dripping with wine, her uniform ruined. She looked at Brad and then at the other men at the table, who were all staring at their plates like nothing had happened. She felt more angry and humiliated than she had ever felt in her life. The room had gone quiet around their table. Other guests were staring, and Sarah could see some of them taking pictures with their phones. She realized that her worst nightmare was coming true. She was making a scene at the most important wedding of the year. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, wine dripping from her uniform onto the expensive carpet. The dining room had become strangely quiet. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. Her face was hot with embarrassment, but underneath the shame, she felt something else growing stronger. Anger. Brad sat back in his chair with a satisfied smirk on his face. He picked up his napkin and wiped his hands like he had just finished eating. Not like he had just humiliated another human being. The other men at his table were still looking down at their plates, pretending nothing had happened. "Well," Brad said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I hope that teaches you some manners. Maybe now you'll think twice before being rude to paying customers." Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She looked around the room and saw other waiters watching her with worried expressions. They all knew that making a scene at an event like this could get someone fired immediately. That was when Mr. Henderson appeared. Sarah had not seen him coming, but suddenly, he was standing right beside her. His face was red, and she could tell he was very angry. But Sarah quickly realized that his anger was not directed at Brad or the situation that had just happened. His anger was directed at her. "Sarah," Mr. Henderson said in a low, tight voice, "what is going on here?" Before Sarah could answer, Brad spoke up. "Your waitress here was being very rude to me and my friends. When I tried to give her some friendly advice about customer service, she got angry and started yelling at me. I'm afraid I accidentally spilled my wine when she grabbed my arm." Sarah stared at Brad in shock. He had just told a complete lie about what had happened. He made it sound like she had been the one who caused the problem, when he was the one who had grabbed her and thrown wine on her. "That's not what happened," Sarah said quickly, looking at Mr. Henderson. "He grabbed my wrist and wouldn't let go. He said inappropriate things to me, and when I asked him to stop, he threw wine on my uniform." Mr. Henderson looked at Sarah with cold eyes. Then he looked at Brad, who was dressed in an expensive suit and clearly came from money. Sarah could see Mr. Henderson making his decision about who to believe. "Sarah," Mr. Henderson said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. These gentlemen are important guests at a very important event. I'm sure whatever happened was just a small problem that can be easily fixed." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had known that Mr. Henderson cared more about money than about his employees, but she had hoped that he would at least listen to her side of the story. "But sir," Sarah said, "he grabbed me. You can probably see the marks on my wrist. And look at my uniform. Why would I pour wine on myself?" Mr. Henderson barely glanced at her wine-stained clothes. "Accidents happen, Sarah. The important thing now is to make sure our guests are happy and comfortable. I think you should apologize to Mr." He looked at Brad questioningly. "Morrison," Brad said with a smile. "Brad Morrison. And I accept your apology, Sarah. We all make mistakes when we're young." Sarah felt like she was in a bad dream. Brad was acting like she had already apologized, when she had done nothing wrong. Mr. Henderson was treating the man who had assaulted and humiliated her like he was the victim. "I want you to apologize to Mr. Morrison and his friends," Mr. Henderson said to Sarah. "Then I want you to go clean yourself up and come back to finish serving their table. We need to put this unpleasant incident behind us and focus on giving our guests the excellent service they deserve." Sarah looked at Mr. Henderson, then at Brad, then at the other men at the table who were now watching with interest. She thought about her job and her savings account. She thought about music school and her dreams. She thought about how much she needed this work, but then she thought about her grandmother. She remembered the old woman's words about having music in her soul and not letting anyone tell her she could not make her dreams come true. She thought about all the times her grandmother had told her to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. "No," Sarah said quietly. Mr. Henderson blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" "No," Sarah said again, her voice getting stronger. "I will not apologize. I did nothing wrong. This man grabbed me, said inappropriate things to me, and threw wine on my uniform. I will not apologize to him." The dining room was now completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped moving to listen to what was happening. Sarah could see Victoria and James, the bride and groom, watching from their table at the front of the room. They looked confused and concerned. Mr. Henderson's face turned bright red. "Sarah, you will apologize right now, or you will be fired. Do you understand me?" Sarah looked around the room one more time. She saw all the wealthy guests in their expensive clothes, eating their fancy food, watching this drama like it was entertainment. She saw her fellow workers, who needed their jobs just as much as she did, looking at her with fear and sympathy. She thought about the money in her savings account. She thought about how hard she had worked for 3 years, taking extra shifts, missing time with friends, saving every penny. She was so close to having enough money for music school, but then she looked at Brad, who was still smiling like this was all a joke to him. She thought about how he had treated her like she was not a real person, like her feelings and dignity did not matter just because she was serving him food. Sarah reached behind her back and untied her apron. The small white apron was part of her uniform, the symbol of her job at the country club. She held it in her hands for a moment, thinking about everything it represented. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong, "I refuse to serve people who don't treat others with basic human dignity." She folded her apron carefully and handed it to her supervisor. Mr. Henderson stared at her like he could not believe what was happening. "You're fired," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "Clean out your locker and leave immediately. Security will escort you out." Sarah nodded. "I understand." She looked one more time at Brad, who was no longer smiling. He seemed surprised that she had actually quit instead of apologizing to him. The other men at the table were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "For what it's worth," Sarah said to Brad, "having money doesn't make you a better person. It just makes you a rich person who treats others badly." Brad's face turned red, and he started to stand up from his chair. "How dare you?" But Sarah was already walking away. She held her head high as she moved through the dining room, even though her uniform was stained and she had just lost her job. Some guests were whispering to each other, and others were taking pictures with their phones. Sarah knew that what had just happened would probably be talked about and shared on social media. As she walked toward the exit, Sarah passed the bride and groom's table. Victoria caught her eye and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." Sarah gave her a small smile and nodded. She was glad that at least someone at this wedding understood that what had happened was wrong. The security guard was waiting for Sarah at the exit to the dining room. He was a kind older man named Frank, who had always been friendly to the staff. He looked embarrassed about having to escort her out. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Frank said quietly as they walked toward the staff area. "Everyone knows you're a good worker. This isn't right." Sarah appreciated his kindness, but she was too upset to respond. She went to her small locker in the staff room and took out her purse and car keys. She had kept a few personal items in the locker, including a small photo of her grandmother that she looked at when work was especially difficult. As she packed her things, Sarah tried not to think about what she had just done. She had thrown away 3 years of hard work and savings. She had given up her job just 6 months before she would have had enough money for music school. She had let her pride and her principles cost her everything she had worked for. But even as these thoughts went through her mind, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. She could not have looked at herself in the mirror if she had apologized to Brad Morrison. She could not have lived with herself if she had continued to serve someone who had treated her like she was not a human being worthy of respect. Frank walked with her to the staff exit, which led to the parking lot behind the country club. As they reached the door, Sarah could hear the sound of music coming from the main dining room. The wedding reception was continuing, and soon people would forget about the drama that had just happened. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," Frank said as he opened the door for her. "You did the right thing in there." Sarah stepped out into the cool night air and took a deep breath. For the first time in hours, she felt like she could breathe properly. She was unemployed, her savings plan was ruined, and her future was uncertain. But she was free from Brad Morrison and Mr. Henderson, and a job that had required her to accept being treated badly. As she walked toward her car, Sarah could still hear the music from the wedding reception. It was a beautiful piano melody, probably the professional musician who had been hired to play during dinner. The music sounded sad and beautiful at the same time, and it made Sarah think about her own piano at home. She got into her old car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about calling her mother to tell her what had happened. Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Her hands were still shaking from the confrontation, and she could smell the wine on her stained uniform. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, and saw that her eyes were red, though she had managed not to cry in front of everyone. She was about to start her car and drive home when she realized she had left her phone charger in the staff break room. She had bought it just last week, and even though it only cost $15, she could not afford to waste money now that she was unemployed. Sarah got out of her car and walked back toward the staff entrance. Frank was no longer there, probably back at his security post inside the building. Sarah used her key card to get back into the staff area, hoping it had not been deactivated yet. The key card still worked. Sarah quietly made her way back to the break room to get her charger. She could hear the sounds of the wedding reception continuing in the main dining room. There was laughter, conversation, and music. It seemed strange that the party was going on normally after what had just happened. As Sarah retrieved her charger from the break room, she heard loud voices coming from the main dining room. They sounded upset, not like the happy celebration sounds from before. Curious, Sarah walked quietly toward the dining room entrance to see what was happening. Through the partially open service door, Sarah could see into the main dining room. What she saw made her gasp in surprise. There was a man near the piano, frantically packing equipment into cases. He was moving quickly, like he was in a hurry to leave. The man looked sick. His face was very red and covered with sweat, and he kept scratching his arms and neck. Sarah recognized the signs immediately because her cousin had the same problem. The man was having a severe allergic reaction to something. "I'm so sorry," the man was saying into his phone as he packed. "I know this is terrible timing, but I can't continue playing. I need to get to the hospital right away. My throat is starting to close up." Sarah moved closer to the door so she could hear better. The man was clearly the piano player who had been hired for the wedding. He was supposed to provide music throughout the dinner and reception, but now he was leaving because of his medical emergency. "Yes, I understand this ruins your plans," the man continued on his phone call, "but I literally cannot breathe properly. If I don't get medical attention soon, this could become life-threatening." Sarah could see Victoria, the bride, standing near the piano with tears in her eyes. She was talking urgently to her new husband James, and both of them looked very upset. Sarah could hear parts of their conversation. "This is a disaster," Victoria was saying. "We planned the whole evening around having live music. Remember? We were going to have the special song for our first dance, and my grandmother's favorite song during dessert, and the surprise song for your parents' anniversary." James put his arm around his wife, trying to comfort her. "Maybe we can just use the sound system for recorded music," he suggested. "It's not the same," Victoria said, wiping tears from her eyes. "We talked about this for months. Live piano music was one of the most important parts of our wedding. It's what I dreamed about since I was a little girl." Sarah watched as the sick piano player finished packing his equipment. He looked genuinely sorry about leaving, but he clearly had no choice. His allergic reaction was getting worse by the minute. "I've called every musician I know," he told Victoria and James. "But it's Saturday night, and everyone else is already working other events. I'm so sorry. I know how important this was to you." Victoria nodded, trying to be understanding even though she was obviously heartbroken. "Your health is more important," she said. "Please go to the hospital and take care of yourself." The piano player left quickly with his equipment. Sarah watched Victoria and James standing alone near the beautiful grand piano. The instrument sat silent and empty, like a symbol of their ruined plans. Sarah could see other wedding guests starting to notice that something was wrong. People were looking around, wondering why the music had stopped. Some guests were checking their phones, probably looking up what had happened based on social media posts about Sarah's earlier confrontation. Victoria's mother approached the couple, looking concerned. "What's happening, dear? Why did the piano player leave?" "He had an allergic reaction," Victoria explained, her voice shaking. "He had to go to the hospital. We don't have anyone to play music for the rest of the evening." Victoria's mother looked shocked. "But what about your first dance? And all the special songs we planned?" "I don't know," Victoria said, starting to cry again. "Everything is ruined." Sarah felt her heart break a little as she watched the bride's distress. She had seen many weddings at the country club, and she knew how much planning went into every detail. Victoria and James had probably spent months choosing the perfect songs for their special moments. Sarah thought about the conversation she had overheard earlier in the week. Victoria had told the wedding planner that music was the most important part of her reception. She had explained that her late grandfather had been a pianist, and having live piano music at her wedding was her way of honoring his memory. As Sarah watched, she could see wedding guests starting to whisper among themselves. Some people were taking pictures of the empty piano. Others were checking their watches, probably wondering what would happen next. Mr. Henderson appeared near the piano, looking stressed and angry. Sarah could see him talking urgently to Victoria and James, probably trying to figure out how to save the situation. He kept looking around the room, and Sarah could tell he was worried about the reputation of the country club. "Can't we just play recorded music?" Mr. Henderson was asking. "We could," James said, "but all of our special songs were arranged specifically for piano. They won't sound right with recorded versions." Victoria wiped her eyes with the tissue. "My grandfather taught me that live music has a soul that recorded music can never have. That's why this was so important to me." Sarah felt a strange feeling in her stomach as she listened to Victoria's words. They reminded her of something her grandmother used to say. Her grandmother had always told her that music was not just about the notes you played, but about the emotion and soul you put into the performance. Sarah looked at the grand piano sitting empty in the middle of the dining room. It was a beautiful instrument, much nicer than the old piano in her apartment. She could tell from looking at it that it was well maintained and would have excellent sound quality. Without really thinking about it, Sarah found herself remembering some of the songs that Victoria and the wedding planner had discussed. She had been working in the dining room when they went over the musical plans for the evening. Sarah had a good memory for music, and she had mentally noted several of the pieces they mentioned. There was Pachelbel's Canon in D, which Victoria wanted for the dinner music. There was The Way You Look Tonight for the first dance. There was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, which had been Victoria's grandfather's favorite piece. And there were several jazz standards that the couple had chosen for the reception dancing. Sarah knew all of these pieces. She had been practicing classical music for years, and she had taught herself many jazz standards because she enjoyed playing different styles. In fact, some of the songs Victoria had chosen were pieces that Sarah particularly loved to play. As Sarah stood there watching the chaos around the empty piano, she felt something stirring inside her. It was the same feeling she got when she sat at her own piano at home after a long day of work. It was the feeling of music calling to her, asking her to bring it to life. But Sarah also remembered what had just happened 30 minutes earlier. She had been fired from this job. She had been humiliated in front of all these people. Brad Morrison was still sitting at his table, probably laughing about how he had gotten a waitress fired. Mr. Henderson had chosen to believe a wealthy guest over his own employee. Why should Sarah help these people? They had not helped her when she needed support. They had watched her be treated badly and done nothing. Some of them had even taken pictures and videos of her humiliation to share on social media. But as Sarah looked at Victoria's tears and James's worried face, she realized that the bride and groom had done nothing wrong. In fact, Victoria had been the only person in the dining room who had mouthed, "I'm sorry," to Sarah as she was being escorted out. Sarah thought about her grandmother again. What would the old woman have done in this situation? Would she have walked away and left the wedding without music? Or would she have found a way to help, even after being treated badly? Sarah knew the answer. Her grandmother had always taught her that music was bigger than personal problems. Music was about bringing joy and beauty into the world, even when the world was not kind to you in return. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Sarah stood at the entrance to the dining room for several more minutes, watching Victoria and James try to figure out what to do about their music problem. The bride had stopped crying, but she still looked very sad. Other family members and friends were gathering around the couple, trying to offer suggestions and comfort. Sarah could hear pieces of their conversations as people tried to come up with solutions. Someone suggested calling a DJ service, but it was too late in the evening, and most would already be working other events. Another person mentioned using a phone app to play music through the sound system, but everyone agreed it would not be the same as live piano music. What about hiring a string quartet? Suggested Victoria's aunt. On a Saturday night with no notice? James replied, even if we could find one, they probably wouldn't know our special songs. Sarah watched Mr. Henderson pacing back and forth near the piano, getting more stressed by the minute. She could tell he was worried about the reputation of the country club. If this wedding turned into a disaster, it could hurt the club's business with other wealthy clients. Meanwhile, the wedding guests were starting to get restless. People were finishing their salads and looking around, wondering when the main course would be served and when the music would resume. Some guests were talking quietly among themselves, and Sarah could tell they were discussing both the missing piano player and the earlier incident with her and Brad Morrison. Sarah looked across the room and saw Brad sitting at his table with his college friends. He was laughing and talking loudly, acting like nothing unusual had happened. It made Sarah angry to see him enjoying himself while Victoria's special day was being ruined. But Sarah forced herself to look away from Brad and focus on the real problem. Victoria and James needed someone to play piano for their wedding, and Sarah was probably the only person in the building who could do it well enough to save their evening. The question was whether Sarah had the courage to offer her help. She knew it would be awkward and uncomfortable. Everyone in the room had just watched her get fired. Many people had taken pictures and videos of her confrontation with Brad. If she walked back into that dining room, she would be the center of attention again. Sarah also worried about how people would react. Would they think she was trying to get her job back? Would they think she was just looking for attention? Would Mr. Henderson even allow her to help? Or would he have security remove her from the building? But as Sarah watched Victoria wipe away another tear, she knew she had to try. Her grandmother had always taught her that music was a gift meant to be shared, especially during important moments in people's lives. Weddings, birthdays, funerals, celebrations, these were the times when music mattered most. Sarah thought about all the hours she had spent practicing piano. She thought about the years of lessons with her grandmother, the countless evenings spent playing after work, and all the songs she had learned. What was the point of having this skill if she did not use it to help people when they really needed it? Sarah took a deep breath and smoothed down her wine-stained uniform. She knew she looked terrible, but there was nothing she could do about that now. She walked quietly into the dining room, trying not to attract too much attention as she made her way toward Victoria and James. As Sarah got closer to the piano, some guests noticed her and started whispering to each other. She could feel people staring at her, and she heard someone say, "Isn't that the waitress who got fired?" Sarah's face felt hot with embarrassment, but she kept walking. When she was about 10 feet away from Victoria and James, she stopped and waited for a moment, not sure how to interrupt their conversation with family members. Victoria saw her first. The bride looked surprised and confused to see Sarah back in the dining room. "Oh," Victoria said, looking at Sarah's stained uniform, "I thought you had left. James and the other family members turned to look at Sarah. She could see various emotions on their faces: confusion, curiosity, and some sympathy. Sarah realized that most of these people had witnessed what happened between her and Brad Morrison. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Sarah said quietly, her voice a little shaky with nerves. "I know this is awkward, and I know I don't belong here anymore, but I couldn't help but notice that you've lost your piano player." Victoria nodded. "Yes, he had an allergic reaction and had to go to the hospital. We're trying to figure out what to do about music for the rest of the evening." Sarah took another deep breath. This was the moment when she had to decide whether to offer her help or just walk away. She thought about her grandmother one more time, and she knew what she had to do. "I know this might sound strange," Sarah said, "but I'm a pianist. I've been playing for 18 years, since I was 6 years old. If you would like, I could try to help with the music for your wedding." The small group around Victoria and James went completely quiet. Everyone stared at Sarah in surprise. She could tell they were trying to process what she had just offered. "You play piano?" James asked, sounding skeptical. "Yes," Sarah said. "I'm classically trained, and I also know jazz and popular music. I heard you and the wedding planner discussing some of your song choices earlier this week when I was working in the dining room. I know most of the pieces you wanted." Victoria looked at Sarah with new interest. "You know Pachelbel's Canon?" "Yes, and Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, and The Way You Look Tonight, and several of the other songs you mentioned," Sarah replied. Victoria's eyes widened. "Those are exactly the pieces we wanted." But she looked at Sarah's stained uniform and then at her husband. "I don't understand. Why would you want to help us after what just happened to you?" Sarah looked around at the faces watching her. She could see Mr. Henderson approaching from across the room, looking angry and confused about why she was back in the dining room. She could see other guests pulling out their phones, probably ready to record whatever happened next. "Because music is bigger than personal problems," Sarah said, repeating something her grandmother had often told her. "Your wedding day should be special and beautiful, regardless of what happened between me and that guest. Music is meant to bring joy, especially on days like this." Victoria's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, they looked like happy tears instead of sad ones. "You would really do that for us, even after how you were treated?" Before Sarah could answer, Mr. Henderson reached their group. His face was red with anger, and Sarah could tell he was about to make a scene. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Mr. Henderson demanded. "I told you to leave immediately. I'm calling security right now." "Wait," Victoria said quickly, putting her hand on Mr. Henderson's arm. "Please don't call security yet. Sarah just offered to play piano for our wedding. Our musician had to leave because of a medical emergency." Mr. Henderson looked confused and frustrated. "She's not qualified to play at an event like this. She's just a waitress. We need to find a real professional musician." "With respect, sir," James said politely but firmly, "it's 8:30 on a Saturday night. We're not going to find another professional pianist at this hour. If Sarah knows our music and is willing to help, I think we should let her try." Sarah looked at Victoria and James with gratitude. She had not expected them to defend her to Mr. Henderson. "But look at her," Mr. Henderson said, gesturing at Sarah's wine-stained uniform. "She can't perform looking like that. What will the other guests think?" Victoria looked at Sarah's stained clothes and seemed to realize the problem. Then her face lit up with an idea. "What size dress do you wear?" Victoria asked Sarah. "Size 6, Sarah replied. Not sure why Victoria was asking. Victoria smiled. "Perfect. I brought 3 different dresses tonight in case I wanted to change for the reception. One of them should fit you perfectly. You can use the bridal suite to change and clean up." Sarah felt overwhelmed by Victoria's kindness. "You would let me borrow one of your dresses?" "Of course," Victoria said. "If you're going to save our wedding, you should look beautiful doing it." Mr. Henderson was shaking his head. "This is highly irregular. We can't just let a former employee." "Mr. Henderson," James interrupted, his voice getting firmer, "this is our wedding, and we're paying for this reception. If we want Sarah to play piano for us, then that's what's going to happen. Either You can support our decision, or we can discuss this further with the club's management on Monday morning. Sarah could see that James came from a wealthy family and was used to getting his way when he spoke with authority. Mr. Henderson clearly realized that arguing with the groom could cause bigger problems for the country club. Fine, Mr. Henderson said reluctantly, but I wanted on record that this was not my idea. Victoria clapped her hands together excitedly. Thank you, Sarah. You have no idea how much this means to us. Let's get you changed, and then we can discuss what music you'll play. As Victoria led Sarah toward the bridal suite, Sarah could hear the buzz of conversation spreading through the dining room. Word was spreading quickly that the fired waitress was coming back to play piano for the wedding. Some guests looked curious, others looked skeptical, and a few looked like they thought the whole situation was entertaining. Sarah caught a glimpse of Brad Morrison as she walked past his table. He was staring at her with a confused expression, like he could not understand why she was back. Victoria led Sarah into the bridal suite, which was a beautiful room with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and a large mirror surrounded by bright bulbs. Sarah had never been in this room before, even though she had worked at the country club for 3 years. It was reserved only for the most important guests. Here, Victoria said, opening a garment bag. I brought this navy blue dress in case I wanted something different for dancing later. It should fit you perfectly. Sarah looked at the dress and gasped. It was made of soft, flowing material that shimmered slightly in the light. It was elegant and beautiful, the kind of dress Sarah had never owned and could never afford to buy. I can't wear something this expensive, Sarah said, touching the fabric gently. What if I damage it? Victoria laughed. You're doing us an enormous favor. The least I can do is let you borrow a nice dress. Besides, if you're going to perform for 200 guests, you should feel confident and beautiful. Victoria left the room so Sarah could change in private. Sarah carefully removed her wine-stained uniform and put on the navy dress. When she looked at herself in the large mirror, she almost did not recognize the person staring back at her. The dress fit perfectly and made her look elegant and sophisticated. Victoria had also left out a pair of low-heeled shoes that were only slightly too big, and some simple jewelry. For the first time in hours, Sarah felt like she could face the crowd in the dining room without feeling embarrassed. Sarah used the bathroom to wash the wine smell from her hands and arms. She fixed her hair, which had come loose from its ponytail during the confrontation with Brad. She even found some lipstick that Victoria had left on the counter, and she put on just a little bit to help herself feel more confident. When Victoria returned to check on her, the bride smiled widely. You look absolutely beautiful. I knew that dress would be perfect on you. Thank you, Sarah said, feeling a little emotional. I can't believe you're being so kind to me after everything that happened tonight. Victoria sat down in one of the comfortable chairs and looked at Sarah seriously. Can I tell you something? What I saw happen between you and that man at table 6 was terrible. You stood up for yourself when no one else would help you. That took real courage. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. I lost my job because of it. I've been saving money for 3 years to go to music school, and now I don't know how I'll afford it. Music school? Victoria asked with interest. Tell me about that. Sarah explained about her dreams of studying music, her grandmother who had taught her to play, and the savings account she had been building by working extra shifts. She told Victoria about the applications she had sent to different schools, and the acceptance letters she had received. That's amazing, Victoria said. No wonder you offered to help us tonight. Music really is important to you, isn't it? It's the most important thing in my life, Sarah admitted. My grandmother always said that music was my gift, and that I should use it to bring beauty into the world. Victoria smiled. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman. I think she would be proud of what you're doing tonight. The two women were interrupted by a knock on the door. James peeked his head into the room. Sorry to bother you, but people are getting restless out there. Are you ready to start the music? Sarah felt her stomach flutter with nerves. She had performed for small groups before, but never for 200 wealthy, sophisticated people. And never after being involved in such a dramatic scene earlier in the evening. I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Sarah said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Victoria stood up and took Sarah's hands. "Remember, these people want to have a good time. They want to hear beautiful music. Don't worry about what happened earlier. Just focus on the piano and the songs." The three of them walked back toward the dining room together. As they approached, Sarah could hear the buzz of conversation and the clinking of glasses. The main course had been served while she was changing, and people were eating and talking. When they entered the dining room, many guests looked up and stared. Sarah could hear whispers as people noticed her transformation from wine-stained waitress to elegant performer. Some people looked surprised, others looked curious, and a few looked skeptical. Sarah walked with Victoria and James to the piano area. The beautiful grand piano sat in the center of the room, its black surface gleaming under the chandelier lights. Sarah had admired this piano many times while working, but she had never imagined she would get to play it. James picked up a microphone that was connected to the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "we want to thank you all for being here to celebrate our wedding with us. As some of you know, our pianist had a medical emergency and had to leave. But we're very fortunate that Sarah has generously offered to provide music for the rest of our evening." The room became quiet as all eyes turned to Sarah. She could feel her heart beating fast, and her hands were slightly shaky. She looked out at the sea of faces and tried to remember Victoria's advice about focusing on the music. Sarah is a trained pianist who has been studying music for 18 years, Victoria added, speaking into the microphone. "We're grateful that she's willing to share her talent with us tonight." Sarah sat down at the piano bench and adjusted the height slightly. She placed her hands on the keys and felt some of her nervousness fade away. This was familiar territory. This was what she loved most in the world. She had decided to start with Pachelbel's Canon in D, the piece Victoria had originally requested for dinner music. It was a beautiful, recognizable piece that most people would enjoy, and it was technically challenging enough to show that she was a serious musician. Sarah took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes rang out clear and pure through the dining room. The piano had excellent sound quality, much better than her old piano at home. Every note was crisp and resonant. As Sarah continued playing, something magical began to happen. The conversations in the room gradually died down as people became absorbed in the music. She could see guests putting down their forks and wine glasses to listen more closely. The canon was a piece that built slowly, starting with a simple melody and gradually adding layers of complexity. Sarah played it exactly the way her grandmother had taught her, with feeling and expression, not just technical accuracy. She let each note sing, and she shaped the phrases with subtle changes in volume and timing. By the time Sarah reached the most complex section of the piece, the dining room was completely silent except for the music. She could feel that she had captured the audience's attention completely. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving around and were listening from the edges of the room. Sarah finished the canon with a gentle, elegant ending that seemed to float in the air for a moment before fading away. For a few seconds, the room remained completely quiet. Then the applause began. It started with Victoria and James, who were clapping enthusiastically and smiling widely. Then other guests joined in, and soon the entire room was applauding. Sarah could see people nodding appreciatively and heard someone say, "That was beautiful." Sarah felt a rush of joy and relief. The first piece had gone well, and she could see that the audience was with her. She looked at Victoria and James, who both gave her encouraging smiles and thumbs up. "That was gorgeous," Victoria called out. "Thank you so much." Sarah smiled and nodded. Then began her next piece. She had chosen Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece that had been Victoria's grandfather's favorite. This was a more intimate, emotional piece that required delicate touch and careful expression. As Sarah played the opening melody of the Nocturne, she thought about her own grandmother and all the times they had played this piece together. Her grandmother had always said that Chopin wrote music that spoke directly to the heart, and Sarah tried to bring that emotional connection to her performance. The Nocturne had sections that were soft and dreamy, and other sections that were more passionate and intense. Sarah navigated all of these changes smoothly, showing her technical skill while also conveying the deep emotion of the music. As she played, Sarah began to notice that the atmosphere in the room had changed completely from earlier in the evening. Instead of the tense, uncomfortable feeling that had followed her confrontation with Brad, there was now a sense of warmth and appreciation. People were smiling, holding hands with their partners, and simply enjoying the beautiful music. Sarah caught a glimpse of Brad Morrison at his table. He was no longer laughing and joking with his friends. Instead, he was sitting quietly, looking uncomfortable, and perhaps even a little ashamed. The other men at his table were listening to the music politely, and Sarah could tell that they were impressed by her playing. When Sarah finished the nocturne, the applause was even stronger than before. She could see that some people in the audience had tears in their eyes. Music had the power to touch people's emotions in ways that words could not, and Sarah could feel that she was creating that kind of connection with the wedding guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said, speaking into the microphone again, "I think we can all agree that Sarah is an extraordinary musician. Victoria and I feel so lucky that she's here to share her gift with us tonight." The applause continued. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself becoming more comfortable and confident at the piano. The initial nervousness had faded away, replaced by the pure joy of making music for an appreciative audience. She moved smoothly between different styles and pieces, taking the guests on a musical journey through classical, jazz, and contemporary songs. After finishing a beautiful rendition of Debussy's Clair de Lune, Sarah noticed that word was spreading beyond the dining room. Kitchen staff members were peeking through the service doors to listen. Even some guests from other events in the country club had wandered over to see what was happening. "Sarah," Victoria said, approaching the piano during a brief pause, "people are asking if you know any jazz standards. Could you play something that people might recognize?" Sarah smiled. "I'd love to. Do you have any requests?" "How about Fly Me to the Moon?" suggested an older gentleman at a nearby table. "That was my wife and my song when we were young." Sarah nodded and began the opening chords of the Frank Sinatra classic. She played it in a smooth, jazzy style with rich harmonies and subtle swing rhythms. As she played, she could see couples at various tables holding hands and smiling at each other, lost in their own memories. The jazz piece was a hit. As soon as Sarah finished, multiple guests called out requests. "Do you know The Girl from Ipanema? How about Autumn Leaves? Can you play Summertime?" Sarah realized that she knew all of these songs and many more. Her years of self-taught jazz study were paying off in ways she had never expected. She began moving from one jazz standard to another, creating a musical atmosphere that transformed the entire dining room. As she played Autumn Leaves, Sarah noticed that people were no longer just sitting and listening. Some couples had gotten up from their tables and were dancing slowly near their chairs. Others were singing along softly with melodies they remembered from their youth. The energy in the room was building, and Sarah could feel it. This was more than just background music for a wedding reception. This was becoming a real musical experience that was bringing people together in a special way. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced during another brief pause, "I think we can all agree that Sarah has exceeded our wildest expectations tonight. But now, if you'll indulge us, we'd like to have our first dance as a married couple." Victoria joined her new husband near the piano, looking radiant in her wedding dress. The couple had originally planned to dance to The Way You Look Tonight, and Sarah was ready to play their special song. Sarah began the opening notes of the romantic ballad, playing it in a gentle, intimate style that was perfect for a first dance. As Victoria and James began to dance, Sarah watched their faces and could see the pure happiness and love they felt for each other. The rest of the guests watched the couple dance, and many people took pictures and videos with their phones. But Sarah noticed that some of the photos and videos were focused on her as well. People were recording her playing piano, probably to share on social media. As Sarah played The Way You Look Tonight, she put all of her skill and emotion into the performance. She varied the tempo slightly to match the couple's dancing, and she added delicate, ornamental touches that made the song uniquely beautiful. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. Victoria and James were both crying happy tears, and they came over to the piano to thank Sarah personally. "That was perfect," Victoria whispered, giving Sarah a hug. "Thank you for making our first dance so special." But the evening was far from over. Other couples began joining Victoria and James on the dance floor, and guests started calling out more requests. Sarah found herself playing everything from romantic ballads to upbeat swing tunes. "Can you play New York, New York?" called out a guest. "How about something by Billy Joel?" suggested another. "Do you know any Beatles songs?" Sarah was amazed to discover that she knew almost every song that was requested. Her years of playing different styles of music had given her a vast repertoire that she had never fully appreciated before. As she played Piano Man by Billy Joel, the entire room began singing along. 200 wealthy, sophisticated people were singing together like they were at a casual piano bar. The formal atmosphere of the elegant country club had been transformed into something warm and communal. Sarah looked around the room as she played and could hardly believe what she was seeing. Earlier in the evening, these same people had watched her be humiliated and fired. Some had even taken pictures of her embarrassment for entertainment. But now, they were looking at her with admiration and respect. They were appreciating her talent and her contribution to making the wedding special. The transformation was remarkable and deeply moving. During a brief break, Sarah noticed that Mr. Henderson was standing near the wall, watching her performance with a complicated expression on his face. She could tell that he was impressed by her playing, but he also looked uncomfortable about the whole situation. Sarah also saw Frank, the security guard, standing near the entrance to the dining room. When he caught her eye, he gave her a big smile and a thumbs up. She could see that he was proud of her and happy that things had turned out well. But the most significant moment came when Sarah looked toward table 6, where Brad Morrison was sitting with his college friends. Brad was no longer laughing or making crude jokes. Instead, he was sitting quietly, looking down at his hands. He seemed uncomfortable and perhaps ashamed of his earlier behavior. The other men at the table were clearly enjoying the music, and Sarah could see them talking among themselves about her performance. She heard one of them say, "She's incredibly talented. I had no idea." Another man at the table looked directly at Brad and said, "You really messed up earlier, man. This woman is amazing." Brad didn't respond, but Sarah could see that his friends' comments were making him think about his actions. For the first time since the confrontation, he looked like he might actually feel bad about what he had done. Sarah decided to test the atmosphere in the room by playing something more challenging. She launched into a virtuosic piece by Liszt that required incredible technical skill and speed. Her fingers flew across the keys in complex passages that most amateur pianists could never hope to play. The room went completely silent as guests watched and listened in amazement. Sarah's hands moved with precision and grace, never missing a note despite the incredible difficulty of the music. When she finished the piece, the silence lasted for several seconds before erupting into the loudest applause of the evening. "Incredible!" someone shouted. "That was absolutely incredible." Victoria approached the microphone again. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that Sarah has given us a musical experience we will never forget. Her talent is extraordinary, and her generosity in sharing it with us tonight has made our wedding truly magical." The applause continued for a full minute. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the positive response and the complete transformation of her situation. A few hours ago, she had been a fired waitress, walking out of the building in shame. Now, she was being celebrated as a gifted musician who had saved the wedding. As the applause died down, Sarah began playing a gentle, beautiful piece. To bring the energy level back to a comfortable place for conversation and dancing, she chose Pachelbel's Canon again, but this time, she played it in a different style, with jazz harmonies and a more contemporary feel. The hybrid classical jazz version was sophisticated and unexpected, showing yet another dimension of her musical abilities. Sarah could see guests nodding appreciatively and whispering to each other about her creativity and skill. As she played, Sarah thought about her grandmother and wished the old woman could see her now. Her grandmother had always believed that Sarah had special talent, but even she might have been surprised to see your granddaughter performing for such an important audience and receiving such an enthusiastic response. Sarah also thought about her dreams of music school and her uncertain future. A few hours ago, those dreams had seemed impossible after losing her job. But now, as she looked out at the faces of 200 people who were genuinely appreciating her music, she began to feel hopeful again. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was just the beginning. The evening was building toward something special, and Sarah could feel it in the air. The best was yet to come. As the evening drew toward its close, Sarah had been playing for nearly 3 hours. Her hands were a little tired, but her spirit was soaring. She had never experienced anything like the connection she felt with this audience, and she knew that this night would change her life forever. The formal dinner portion of the wedding was over, and the reception had evolved into a more relaxed celebration. Some guests were dancing, others were mingling and talking, and many were gathered around the piano, making requests and complimenting Sarah on her performance. "You've been absolutely wonderful," said an elegant older woman who introduced herself as Victoria's grandmother. "I haven't heard piano playing this beautiful since my late husband used to play for me. You have a rare gift, my dear." Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. Compliments like this meant more to her than she could express. "Thank you so much. That means the world to me." As Sarah played a gentle version of Moon River, she noticed Victoria and James approaching the piano. They both looked emotional, and Sarah could tell they wanted to say something important. Victoria took the microphone. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment," she said. The room gradually became quiet as guests turned to listen. "James and I want to thank all of you for being here to celebrate our wedding with us," Victoria continued. "This has been the most perfect day of our lives, and you've all helped make it special." Victoria paused and looked at Sarah. "But there's one person who deserves special recognition tonight. A few hours ago, our hired pianist had a medical emergency and had to leave. Our entire evening of music was in jeopardy, and I was heartbroken because live piano music was so important to us." The room was completely silent now, with everyone listening intently. Then Sarah stepped forward and offered to help us, even though she had just experienced a very difficult situation earlier this evening, Victoria continued. "She didn't have to do that. She could have just gone home. But instead, she chose to use her incredible talent to save our wedding." Victoria's voice was getting emotional. "Sarah, you didn't just play music for us tonight. You created magic. You turned our reception into something we will remember for the rest of our lives. Every song was perfect, every moment was beautiful, and you did it all with such grace and generosity." The applause started softly and then built to a thunderous ovation. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the warmth and appreciation of the crowd. Many people were standing and clapping, and she could see genuine smiles and admiration on faces throughout the room. James took the microphone from his wife. "Sarah, Victoria and I talked, and we want to do something to thank you properly for what you've done for us tonight." James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This contains payment for your musical performance tonight, of course. But it also contains something else." Sarah looked at the envelope curiously, not sure what James meant. "Victoria and I both come from families that believe in supporting education and the arts," James continued. "When we learned that you're saving money to attend music school, we decided that we wanted to help make that dream come true." Sarah's heart started beating faster. She had no idea what James was about to say. Victoria took the microphone back. "Sarah, inside that envelope is a check for $10,000. It's enough to cover your first year of music school tuition." Sarah gasped and felt her knees go weak. $10,000 was exactly what she needed to start school in the fall. It was more money than she had ever seen at one time. "We can't accept your talent and generosity without giving something meaningful back," Victoria said. "This is our wedding gift to you, and we hope it helps you pursue your dreams." The applause was deafening. Sarah was crying now, unable to control her emotions. She stood up from the piano bench and walked over to Victoria and James, who both hugged her warmly. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered through her tears. "This is the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me. You earned it, James said. You saved our wedding and gave us memories that will last forever. But the surprises weren't over yet. As the applause died down, Sarah noticed that many guests were approaching the piano area. Some were holding business cards, others had their phones out, and all of them looked like they wanted to talk to her. "Excuse me," said a well-dressed man who introduced himself as a hotel manager. "I'd like to offer you a position playing piano in our restaurant on weekends. The pay is excellent, and the hours would allow you to attend school during the week." Another man stepped forward. "I'm a wedding planner, and I would love to add you to my list of recommended musicians." "You would have more bookings than you could handle." A woman in an elegant dress handed Sarah her business card. "I represent several private clients who host events at their homes. They're always looking for talented pianists, and the pay is very good." Sarah looked at all the business cards and offers being presented to her. In one evening, she had gone from being unemployed to having multiple job opportunities. But the most meaningful conversation came from an unexpected source. As the crowd around the piano began to thin out, Sarah saw Brad Morrison approaching. He looked nervous and uncomfortable, but determined to say something. "Sarah," Brad said quietly when he reached her, "I owe you a huge apology." Sarah looked at him warily, sure what to expect. "What I did earlier tonight was completely wrong," Brad continued, his voice shaking slightly. "I was drunk, but that's no excuse for how I treated you. You didn't deserve any of that." Sarah listened quietly, surprised by his apparent sincerity. "Listening to you play tonight made me realize what an incredible person you are," Brad said. "You have amazing talent, and more importantly, you have character and grace that I clearly lack. I'm ashamed of my behavior, and I wanted you to know that." Brad reached into his wallet and pulled out several $100 bills. "This isn't nearly enough to make up for what I did, but I want you to have it. Maybe it can help with your school expenses." Sarah looked at the money for a moment, then gently pushed it back toward Brad. "I appreciate the apology," she said. "That means more to me than money. But I don't need your cash. What I needed was respect, and you've given me that now by acknowledging what happened." Brad nodded, looking relieved that she had accepted his apology even though she wouldn't take his money. "You're a better person than I am," he said. "I hope music school is everything you dream it will be." As Brad walked away, Sarah felt a sense of closure about the evening's earlier events. The confrontation that had seemed so devastating a few hours ago now felt like just a small, unimportant part of a much larger and more beautiful story. The evening was winding down, and guests were beginning to leave. Victoria and James found Sarah one more time to say goodbye. "We'll never forget what you did for us tonight," Victoria said, hugging Sarah tightly. "Please stay in touch and let us know how music school goes." "I will," Sarah promised. "And thank you again for the most generous gift I've ever received. You've literally changed my life." As the last guest departed, Sarah helped the staff clean up the piano area. Mr. Henderson approached her as she was gathering the sheet music she had used. "Sarah," he said awkwardly, "I owe you an apology as well. I should have supported you earlier tonight instead of automatically siding with the customer. What you did this evening was remarkable, and it reflected very well on the country club." Sarah nodded politely. "Thank you for saying that. If you ever want your job back," Mr. Henderson continued, "the position is available, and perhaps we could also arrange for you to play piano occasionally for special events." Sarah smiled. "That's kind of you to offer, but I think my waitressing days are behind me. I have music school to look forward to now, and several new opportunities to pursue." As Sarah changed back into her own clothes in the bridal suite, she reflected on the incredible evening. She carefully folded Victoria's beautiful dress and left it with a thank you note. When Sarah walked to her car in the parking lot, she felt like a completely different person than the one who had walked out of the building hours earlier. She was carrying the envelope with the $10,000 check, along with a handful of business cards from potential employers and clients. But more importantly, she was carrying the memory of an evening when her music had brought joy to hundreds of people. She had discovered that her talent was far greater than she had realized, and that she had the courage to stand up for herself when necessary. Sarah sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine, looking back at the country club where so much had happened. She thought about her grandmother and wished she could share this incredible story with her. Then Sarah smiled and started her car. Tomorrow, she would call the music schools that had accepted her and confirm her enrollment for the fall semester. She would also start following up on the job opportunities she had received. But tonight, she would go home and play her grandmother's old piano, just like she did every evening. Except tonight, she would be playing as someone who finally understood the true power of her gift. 3 months later, Sarah was enrolled at the prestigious Berklee College of Music, studying piano performance and composition. She played weekend gigs at upscale hotels and private events, earning more money than she had ever imagined possible.